On October 25, 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump announced a surprise 10% tariff on Canadian imports, sending shockwaves through North America and raising questions about the stability of trade relationships just days before the APEC 2025 summit in Asia. This decision represents more than a typical protectionist measure. It comes amid escalating tensions over a controversial incident involving a purportedly altered video of former President Ronald Reagan, allegedly released by Canada to influence U.S. public opinion and trade policy. The combination of economic measures and media controversies underscores Trump's strategy of leveraging both political theater and hardline tariffs to assert the United States' America First agenda. Observers around the world are closely watching the U.S.-Canada dynamic, recognizing that this move could have broader ramifications. Over $30 billion in annual trade is potentially affected, encompassing key sectors such as auto parts, lumber, and agriculture. Analysts warn that Canada's response, or lack thereof, could ripple through global markets, disrupt supply chains, and complicate the upcoming APEC negotiations. Beyond the numbers, this is a story about political symbolism, historical narrative, and the intertwining of diplomacy with domestic messaging. Trump's approach reflects a blend of performance and policy, a hallmark of his administration. By framing the tariff as a reaction to a fraudulent and hostile act, Trump positions himself as a defender of national honor and economic sovereignty. At the same time, this move sends a clear signal to international partners. U.S. leadership and interests will not be questioned or undermined, even in the context of long-standing alliances. For policymakers, investors, and citizens, the challenge is parsing the immediate economic consequences from the long-term strategic signaling embedded in this action. In essence, the announcement is a microcosm of Trump's governance style, aggressive, unpredictable, and highly visible. As the United States prepares to send its delegation to APEC 2025, the world will watch closely to see how these tariffs reshape discussions on trade, diplomacy, and regional stability. The unfolding story highlights the complex interplay between politics, economics, and global perception, setting the stage for a highly scrutinized international tour. On October 25th, President Donald Trump officially imposed an additional 10% tariff on Canadian imports, escalating trade tensions just as global attention turns toward the Asia-Pacific. The move, framed as a response to what Trump describes as a fraudulent and hostile act by Canada, involves a mix of both symbolic and practical measures. According to Trump, Canadian authorities allegedly released a manipulated video portraying former President Ronald Reagan as opposing U.S. tariffs, a claim which the Reagan Foundation explicitly refuted, confirming that no authorization had been given for the footage's public release. The tariffs target a range of goods, particularly affecting industries that constitute a substantial portion of U.S.-Canada trade, including automotive parts, construction materials, lumber, and key agricultural products. By imposing these duties, Trump not only seeks to retaliate for perceived misinformation, but also to demonstrate to domestic audiences that the United States will defend both economic interests and historical integrity. Analysts note that such tariffs can serve as leverage in broader negotiations, providing Washington with tools to pressure Ottawa while simultaneously sending a clear signal to other trading partners about U.S. enforcement of its policies. The timing of the announcement is particularly noteworthy. With the APEC 2025 summit imminent, the tariffs ensure that U.S.-Canada relations, and by extension, North American economic policy, will dominate discussions, forcing other regional leaders to consider the ramifications of the dispute in the context of wider trade negotiations. Financial markets reacted immediately, with investors reassessing exposure to cross-border supply chains and multinational corporations with significant Canadian operations. Trump's statement accompanying the tariff declaration emphasized national pride and historical continuity. We're not going to allow our history or our trade to be distorted. Canada acted against us, and we are taking action to protect the United States. The rhetoric underscores a pattern seen throughout his presidency. Economic measures are not merely tools for negotiation, but also instruments for public messaging and domestic political positioning. Speaker notes should highlight the dual nature of this action, both economic and symbolic, reinforcing the narrative that U.S. sovereignty and historical integrity are intertwined in trade policy. Contextualize the tariff within the broader framework of Trump's America First strategy and its implications for international relations. The immediate catalyst for the tariffs stems from an alleged Canadian video portraying former President Reagan as opposing U.S. tariffs, a depiction Trump and his advisors describe as manipulated and misleading. According to reports, the video circulated online prior to key Supreme Court trade rulings, potentially influencing public sentiment in ways detrimental to U.S. interests. The Reagan Foundation has confirmed that it did not authorize the video, and legal action is now under consideration to address what it calls a violation of intellectual property and historical integrity. Trump framed the incident as more than a technicality. Canada misled the public to sway our Supreme Court's trade ruling. It's a scam, he said. This statement reflects a broader approach of linking economic policy with moral or ethical narratives, positioning the United States as defending not only material interests, but also historical truth. In turn, this sets a precedent for future trade disputes, where media manipulation could be invoked as justification for economic sanctions. The controversy also raises questions about the role of digital media in shaping diplomacy. While traditional negotiations relied on back-channel communications and formal statements, the rapid spread of information or misinformation online can directly affect policy responses. Analysts suggest that governments and corporations alike must now consider reputational risk in addition to financial risk when engaging in international transactions. Speaker notes for this segment should emphasize the interaction between media, perception, and policy, illustrating how Trump leverages alleged misinformation to justify tangible economic actions. Discuss the intersection of diplomacy, historical narrative, and trade law. Prior to the tariff announcement, U.S.-Canada trade discussions aimed to revise North American trade terms ahead of the APEC summit. However, on October 23, Trump suspended negotiations, citing Canada's deceptive propaganda. This abrupt halt froze months of dialogue, undermining ongoing efforts to harmonize tariffs, trade quotas, and regulatory frameworks. From the U.S. perspective, suspending talks communicates firmness and a zero-tolerance stance on perceived bad faith actions. From the Canadian side, officials have expressed willingness to resume discussions, but noted that policy decisions are ultimately determined by the United States. Prime Minister Mark Carney stated, "We're ready to talk anytime, but we can't dictate U.S. policy," highlighting the tension between readiness for dialogue and the constraints of bilateral diplomacy. The collapse of trade talks also carries broader economic implications. North American supply chains, particularly in automotive manufacturing and agricultural trade, face immediate uncertainty. Analysts caution that prolonged disputes could increase costs, disrupt production schedules, and introduce volatility in commodity markets. Investors, meanwhile, must reassess risk exposure, as uncertainty over tariffs can affect both equity and currency markets. Speaker notes should frame the suspension as a strategic maneuver, balancing immediate economic risk with long-term political signaling. Highlight how sudden policy shifts can disrupt trade negotiations and the broader economic ecosystem. The newly imposed tariffs affect over $30 billion in annual trade, creating significant economic and political ripple effects. Critical industries such as auto parts, lumber, and agricultural exports are expected to face higher costs, potentially influencing domestic prices and supply chain efficiency. Companies heavily reliant on cross-border trade must now adapt to increased tariffs, which could trigger strategic realignments or sourcing adjustments. Politically, the tariffs strain relations not only with Canada, but also with other North American and APEC partners. Analysts warn that this approach risks undermining collective bargaining power and complicates multilateral trade discussions. Critics argue that by conflating economic policy with media controversy, Trump risks transforming trade diplomacy into domestic theater. The administration frames these measures as a proactive defense of U.S. interests, blending economic leverage with messaging on sovereignty and fairness. The tariffs reinforce a broader narrative of America asserting itself on the global stage, sending a signal to allies and competitors alike that perceived slights or manipulations will have real economic consequences. Speaker notes should cover both macroeconomic impacts and the political message, detailing how tariffs can function as tools for domestic signaling while also influencing international perception and policy coordination. With the tariffs now in place, all eyes turn to Trump's upcoming Asia trip for APEC 2025. Stops in Malaysia, China, Japan, and South Korea will likely involve discussions on trade, technology, and regional stability, but the Canada tariffs ensure that U.S. economic aggression will be a dominant topic. Observers predict that leaders across the Pacific will press Trump on the implications of his North American trade actions, including potential disruptions to supply chains and bilateral agreements. The tariffs also signal a broader America First 2.0 approach, combining economic assertiveness with visible enforcement of perceived slights or misinformation. From a diplomatic perspective, the timing creates a complex environment for APEC negotiations. While Trump's Asia tour is designed to showcase U.S. leadership, the Canada dispute injects a degree of unpredictability, forcing allies and competitors to recalibrate their expectations. In effect, the tariffs have already preemptively influenced global discussions, framing the narrative before the first summit session begins. Speaker notes should highlight the interplay between domestic policy, international diplomacy, and summit strategy, emphasizing how the U.S. administration uses timing, messaging, and economic tools to project influence and shape global perceptions.